Hello, my name is Joshua Landis. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And it's my great pleasure today to interview Barbara Slavin, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center, and she's a correspondent for El Monitor in Washington. She's also the author of a book on Iran, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and a Twisted Path to Confrontation. We're going to talk about the U.S. relationship with Iran today. Welcome, Barbara. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us, how did we get the United States, how did Iran become the #1 enemy of the United States?
Well, first let me take issue with your description of Iran. I don't think it's the #1 enemy of the United States, although there are some people who are trying to put this forward now. In fact, the United States and Iran were very good friends at one point in history. For the last 36 years, they have been somewhat estranged because of the Islamic Revolution. But I would argue that the U.S. and Iran actually have a lot of interests in common in the Middle East, and that those who try to portray Iran as the #1 enemy of the United States are worried that the U.S. is reorienting its policy in the region away from some of the other countries that have become U.S. allies over the years.
Such as whom?
Such as Saudi Arabia, such as Israel, for example. They are very, very concerned that the U.S. and Iran will realize that they have a good bit in common, and that the U.S. will begin to think of Iran, think of what Iran wants and what Iran can do in the region, perhaps more than some of these other countries.
But somebody as illustrious as Kissinger, for example, when the U.S. began this last summer, started its war on ISIS after the beheading of the two journalists, he warned. He said, yes, we've got to go after ISIS. It's a danger to America, but we should not forget that Iran is the real enemy in the region.
You know, it's troubling to me that someone of his stature would say this. Obviously, Iran has interests. Iran wants to increase its influence in the region. But we have to remember how we got here. It was the George W. Bush administration that overturned the sectarian balance in the region when he went in and got rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And if you look at the troubles of the Middle East since that time, really the disintegration of the nation states of the Middle East, about which you've written very eloquently, I think it all can be traced back to the decision by the United States to go in and remove Saddam. That created al-Qaeda in Iraq, which gave birth to ISIS. That in many ways led to the dissolution of Syria, and even in some ways had impact on the Arab Spring writ large, encouraged some that were looking to overthrow autocratic regimes. So we have to look at where this all began. I see Iran as an opportunistic power with some strengths but also many weaknesses. Iran took advantage of the overthrow of Saddam. After all, Saddam's Iraq was Iran's biggest rival in the region. The U.S. went in and got rid of it for Iran. And Iran responded by mobilizing support among the Shia in Iraq, who were the majority in that country, who had been suppressed. The Iranians sent in Shia militias, Iraqi Shia militias that had found sanctuary in Iran during the Saddam period, groups like the Badr Corps, for example. And Iran has continued this pattern of mobilizing Shia in Iraq, in Syria, where they have, of course, the alliance, as you know well, with the Alawites, using Hezbollah in Lebanon, now even extending into Yemen and the Zaidis, the Houthis in Yemen. But if you look back at the initial opportunities, they were almost all provided by either U.S. intervention or, in the case of Lebanon, Israeli intervention, which gave rise to Hezbollah. So for Henry Kissinger now to blame Iran for taking advantage of these opportunities that were presented to Iran on a silver platter seems to me the height of irony and also in some ways willful ignorance.
Well, let me play devil's advocate on this point a little bit. Let's say, okay, you're right. America, let's say we are to blame America for, in a sense, setting Iran up for expansion in the region. Doesn't that mean that America then, it's incumbent upon America, it's their duty, not because they're guilty, but because they have to defend their allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, as you've mentioned, from a growing Iranian imperial presence in the Middle East?
Well, yeah, let's look at the other side of this. I mean, the Iran is the behemoth, you know, as this terrifying nation that is on the march in the Middle East. That's the other side of it. Iran has many weaknesses internally and in the region because of the fact that it's a Shia power, which of course immediately antagonizes many of the Sunnis. We've seen increased sectarianism, obviously, since the overthrow of Saddam, and particularly since the outbreak of the uprising in Syria. Iran has economic problems, which are quite severe because of the sanctions that have been placed on Iran, particularly since 2006, because of its nuclear program. Iran has very complicated internal politics, a regime that is not popular, frankly, that is quite unpopular because of the economic problems, because of the restrictions on personal freedoms. So it seems to me that various the proponents of this Iran as enemy theory, you know, they try to have it both ways. On the one hand, they say, you know, Iran is very dangerous, Iran is on the march. On the other hand, they say Iran has been hurt by sanctions. So which is it? And how do you reconcile those two views?
How badly has Iran been hurt by sanctions? What is, describe for us the sanctions regime a little bit, without going into too much detail, but to what extent has it really hurt Iran? To what extent is Iran trying to patch up relations with the United States in order to get out from those sanctions?
It's had an extreme impact. I mean, the value of the currency, it was hovering around 10,000 rials to the dollar for many, many, many years. It's now 35,000 rials to the dollar, absolutely plummeted. Iran exports only about 1 million barrels of oil a day. It used to export 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. Iran does not have access to its revenues, its oil revenues. They are frozen in bank accounts in 5 or 6 countries that are now permitted to continue to import Iranian oil. The Europeans have stopped almost entirely. Under an interim nuclear agreement, which was reached in 2013, that has been extended twice, Iran now has access to only $700 million a month in its own oil revenues, which is less than it's actually earning. Unemployment is high. Inflation has come down a little bit under President Rouhani, but it's still high. There is a huge brain drain, which we benefit from, and Europe and other countries benefit from. Educated Iranians leave in droves. It is not a happy place. It's a place with a lot of problems, a lot of dysfunction. Prostitution, drug addiction, young people who are desperately searching for a way to deal with the economic realities of the country.
Are sanctions a good and effective tool? I ask this because clearly they were in South Africa. They helped to break apart the regime there, the apartheid regime. But in places like Syria, where we've had the U.S. imposed sanctions for decades, and they got worse, of course, in 2005 when Syria was the Hariri incident, and Syria was helping jihadists get into Iraq. But rather than the regime caving into American demands and breaking its relations with Iran, the Assad regime collapsed, in a sense, and we have civil war today. I don't know if we want to blame them directly on the lowered economic growth, increasing poverty, and so forth that was present in Syria before the revolution. It's not clear that that's the main driver of the revolution, where the economic, but certainly it played a role. To what extent do you think that Iran will blink and become a country that America wants to deal with? And or will it just collapse like Syria did?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to collapse. Iran has a lot of advantages that Syria does not, including a more cohesive population ethnically than Syria has. Iran also has enormous resources beyond oil and gas. It actually relies less on its oil and gas than some countries like Saudi Arabia, for example. So no, Iran won't collapse. I think the main impact of the sanctions, and this has been because of their multilateral nature, particularly since 2010, has been to affect Iranian public opinion so that President Rouhani was elected in 2013. He was the candidate who promised that he would do something about the sanctions and that he would ease Iran's international isolation. That was his main campaign message, and he won those elections.
How much power does Rouhani have?
Mm-hmm.
Lots of the naysayers in Washington say, this guy is fundamentally weak, he's constitutionally weak, he doesn't have the power. We've seen this with presidents from the beginning to the end. They come up, they say, popular sovereignty, I was elected, I have the power. But then they run up against the supreme guide. Mm-hmm. And Khamenei he's the real ruler. He's in charge of the army, the judiciary, you go on.
Yeah.
How do you expect that struggle to play out?
Well, I would agree with you. Obviously, the supreme leader, I mean, look at the name. He is the supreme leader of the country. But I think Rouhani is one of the more powerful presidents that Iran has had in recent years, in large part because he has an excellent relationship with the supreme leader. He is a pillar of the Iranian political elite. He was the supreme leader's representative on their National Security Council for something like 17 years. He is not a raving reformer. He is a pragmatist. And he is very careful, and his foreign minister, Javad Zarif, very careful in the negotiations with the United States and the other members of the international community to go only so far, to abide by the red lines which have been set down, not just by the supreme leader, but by the establishment writ large in Iran. Khamenei has to pay attention to various circles of power in the country. He understands how unpopular he is. He made the most extraordinary appeal before the 2013 presidential elections. He appealed to Iranians who do not believe in the Islamic Republic to come out and vote, suggesting that Iran as a nation state was under threat from the West, from sanctions, and that they should show their loyalty to their own country by participating in the elections. So he knows that Rouhani is an important resource for him, that Iranians by and large were pleased with Rouhani's election and pleased with these nuclear negotiations, and that they want a deal. So that's where the sanctions came in. I don't think the sanctions themselves will force Iran to accept a deal that will lose face for the regime. And that's why these negotiations have been so complicated, so difficult, because Iran is insisting on maintaining basically most of its nuclear infrastructure, but under certain restrictions that would make it very difficult for Iran to build nuclear weapons. But this will be a face-saving deal for Iran, or there will be no deal.
Let me ask you, before we go on to the opportunities that a deal with Iran would open up, let me ask you about the dangers that Iran presents to Israel and to Saudi Arabia. But Israel first, because that's a primary relationship with the United States, and I think it's a big stumbling block for any deal the president wants to make. We know that Netanyahu is coming to Congress. What dangers does Iran present to Israel? Is it sort of baked in the ideology of Iran that it's got to wipe Israel out as a Zionist entity? Is it going to take the fight to Israel through Hezbollah, through Syria, by surrounding Israel and destroying it? Is that the ambition of the elite around the Supreme Guide, or not?
I think it's overstated. Obviously, Israel is the lesser Satan. The United States is the great Satan, in the terminology used by Ayatollah Khomeini during the revolution. And Iran has wrapped itself in the Palestinian cause and in the Lebanese Shia cause against Israel as a way of trying to show that it is more than a Shia power, that it has a pan-Islamic appeal, if you will. But Iran is not in a position to destroy Israel. Israel has 200 nuclear weapons. It has second strike capability. Iran has 0 nuclear weapons. So this is rhetoric on the part of Iranian officials. Certainly it's rhetoric that was used by the previous president, Ahmadinejad, and it only served to isolate Iran and hurt Iran, his comments about wiping Israel off the map and Holocaust denial and so on. Israel is the strongest military power in the region, and it knows that. I think the threat is more political, more ideological, in the sense that it undermines Israel's sense of legitimacy in the region. But leaders like Netanyahu use Iran as a scapegoat, as a way of avoiding dealing with the real threats to Israel, which are primarily internal, and also in dealing with the Palestinians, Israel's inability to reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians is what undermines it. Israel's discrimination against its own Arab citizens, this is what undermines it.
And what about Saudi Arabia? Because they are also this growing paranoia about Shiite encirclement, especially with Yemen going on today and so forth. What's the truth of that?
Well, look, this is an old rivalry, as you well know. It goes back centuries. It's a rivalry between Persians and Arabs. It's a rivalry between two oil powers. It's a rivalry between the two big powers in the Muslim world in that area that both want to exert hegemony over others. Some of it is legitimate, some of it is paranoia. Some of it also is internally based. As you know, Saudi Arabia has a large Shia minority, which is discriminated against. And
how badly is it discriminated against?
Pretty badly. I mean, this is a country, Saudi Arabia, that has, you know, a self-image as the major Muslim power. It's the repository of Mecca and Medina. It has a religious strain, Wahhabism, that is militantly anti-Shia, that does not even consider most Shias to be Muslims, considers them to be apostates. And Saudi Arabia, far more than Iran, frankly, because it has more resources, has been funding like-minded movements around the world, spreading Wahhabi Islam through madrasas to places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. Wahhabism, frankly, forms the sort of ideological base of groups like the Islamic State. So Iran may be trying to press forward a different vision of Islam, and certainly to support Shias, but Shias are the minority in Islam, and Iran does not have the financial resources to spread its ideas around the world. This is another example of where, you know, this idea that Iran is somehow the repository of all evil, and that it's going to march through the region, you know, like a hot knife through butter. It's ridiculous. Iran cannot do that because of its identity as a Shia state, and also because it's Persian, ethnically Persian, not Arab. And most Arabs simply will not accept, you know, Persian hegemony. The days of the Persian Empire are long over.
So what you're describing here is that you've got a sectarian power in Iran, but you also have very sectarian power in Saudi Arabia.
Very much
and,
so.
What is America's interest in this? Is it to balance these two, or is it to side with its traditional friends, Saudi Arabia, Israel, against Iran, and to try to weaken Iran as much as possible? Or you know, what should America's larger vision of a Middle East be, and where does Iran fit in that?
America needs options. And what we have deprived ourselves of because of the lack of a proper relationship with Iran is options. We've been forced to rely on Saudi Arabia and Israel because we did not you know, have a means of really reaching out to Iran. And here again, I blame George Bush, because after 9/11, there was a tremendous opportunity, which I've written about in my book, that was simply thrown away by the Bush administration. Iran and the United States were on the same side, opposed to the Taliban in Afghanistan, opposed to al-Qaeda.
And opposed to Saddam Hussein.
Opposed to Saddam Hussein. President Khatami is a very moderate figure in Iranian politics, and he reached out in a very dramatic way. I remember going to Iran in December 2001, and frankly, it was the most pro-American mood I have ever seen in Iran. There were spontaneous demonstrations in sympathy with the United States after 9/11. There were no such demonstrations in any other Muslim country in the world. In fact, there were places where Muslims came out and celebrated the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon because the U.S. was perceived as being anti-Palestinian, pro-Israel, and so on. Iran was unique in its understanding of what had happened and its sympathy with the United States. And what did George Bush do? He pocketed Iranian help in getting rid of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and then he put Iran on the axis of evil in his State of the Union address in 2002. He discredited the moderates, the reformers in Iran, discredited the Khatami administration, gave power to Iranian neoconservatives like Ahmadinejad, who subsequently were able to take over the rest of the apparatus of the state, convinced Ayatollah Khamenei that it's useless to do business with the U.S., that the U.S. will always be opposed to Iran, implacably hostile. So, you know, I think there are a lot of mistakes that have been made along the way. But the Obama administration and President Obama understood early on that there was a possibility of reaching out to the Iranians, of having some cooperation with them, certainly of keeping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which is a very important priority for President Obama, but also of gaining options in terms of dealing with Sunni fundamentalist jihadist groups, which in my mind present the major threat, not just to the United States, but to Western Europe. Look at the attacks that we saw in Paris, the attacks we've seen in Belgium. This is the major threat to the United States, not Iran.
And how does Iran, so what are the options? What options does this open up that could possibly improve the United States' rather dismal position in the Middle East today?
Well, we've already seen a lot of benefits. I'm giving a talk later today called A Truce, Not a Breakthrough. We already have a kind of truce with Iran that's been in effect since Rouhani came in. We have high-level diplomatic contact on a daily basis, a near daily basis with Iran. Our Secretary of State, their Foreign Minister, call each other by their first names. We have had these extraordinary negotiations, which have been primarily about the nuclear issue, but they've also talked about the Islamic State. They've also talked about Syria and Iraq to some extent. And this is a way, again, for us to, if not coordinate, then at least deconflict some of the actions that we're taking in that part of the world to deal with the threat posed by the Islamic State.
What about Iraq? To what extent can we work with Iran in Iraq? Lots of people say Iran's getting way too much influence in Iraq. They're supporting militias that are doing the heavy lifting, and we're sort of sitting around trying to get power sharing going in the new Iraqi government. But all of that's going to be dead in the water as long as Iran has the major share of influence that we have to push them out of Iraq in order to get power sharing.
Yeah, well, we're not going to push them out of Iraq. As I said, when we overthrew Saddam, we gave Iran influence in that country, much more influence than it otherwise would have had. So we can't push them out. It's too late for that. The question is, can we coordinate, can we deconflict? And right now, let's face it, these Shia militias, certainly they have unsavory aspects, but they are the major fighting force while the United States tries to help the Iraqi army get back off its feet.
Syria, obviously Syria is a much more complicated issue for the United States. How should we be dealing with Iran in Syria that's wedded to this regime, but is a partner in some ways in fighting ISIS, as you've mentioned? Do we just put that aside for the time being? How do you see the Syria dilemma?
Yeah, I think that it's important for us to try to groom some sort of opposition to Assad that is multi-confessional, that's Sunni and Alawite and Christian, if possible. There have been efforts to do so. They've been very difficult. There's been no charismatic opposition figure who's appeared in Syria, unfortunately, that could unite the opposition to Assad. But we have to maintain what is left of the central Syrian state. To blow that up now would be extremely counterproductive. Ultimately, a solution to Syria is going to require buy-in from the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, and the Saudis. And it's probably going to take a very long time, and unfortunately a lot more people are going to die before that happens. But I think the U.S. priority in Syria clearly now is to try to contain the Islamic State, to keep it from taking yet more territory. And that, unfortunately trumps a political solution that would get rid of Assad for now.
Right. I was going to ask you about Hezbollah, but we're going to put that aside for the time being. I want to close with a larger question about tolerance and getting to the end of this very confessional war that's going on in the Middle East. And many people have likened it to the 30 Years' War, to the religious wars in Europe. How do you see hope for everybody, for Muslim society to climb down from this terrible sectarian demonization that's going on both sides? The Saudis versus the Rafida, the Shiites, and the Shiites versus this Takfiri Sunni anxiety that they have. How do you see that playing out in the future, and do you see hope for some kind of growing tolerance?
A lot is going to depend on the new king of Saudi Arabia and the people around him, and whether they're able to do something about this. I mean, under King Abdullah, we saw an intensification of sectarianism. We saw Bandar bin Sultan running around, arming the Sunni forces of opposition to Assad and so on, and certainly talking up a very anti-Iran line. What we talked about earlier in terms of the demonization of Iran by some people in Saudi Arabia and Israel and in Washington reflects this. So I think it's incumbent on the Saudis to try to climb down from this. It's incumbent certainly on Iran. President Rouhani has expressed an interest in trying to have some sort of reconciliation with Saudi Arabia. There's some new cards that the Iranians have to play in terms of their influence in both Iraq and Syria and now in Yemen, right on Saudi Arabia's doorstep. And I was told reliably by an Iranian that Yemen is, in a sense, revenge for Bahrain when the Saudis went in and crushed a Shia uprising by majority Shia. So these are complicated matters. There's not a lot of trust between these parties, but they will need to sit down and talk about what their enmity is doing to the Middle East at some point.
Can America play a role in trying to bring about that kind of understanding?
Yes, I think so. If we don't take sides blindly in these quarrels. And in fact, we're trying to reach out now to the Houthis in Yemen and so on. And certainly we have the possibility, especially if there is a nuclear agreement, for a much more nuanced relationship with Iran, where we can hear their point of view and we can see the region in a nuanced way, not in a black and white way.
Well, Barbara Slavin, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah,
Thank
likewise.
you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.